setting. But a critical point is that at this latitude, you're sort of at the border between arid conditions, desert-like conditions, and more humid conditions, depending upon the specifics of currents and of the time in Earth's history. It could be ranging from more humid to more arid at times. Another important point to note is that being in the subtropics, the southern subtropics, we're in an area that would have been subject to strong hurricane forces, and just as it is today, and during a world which was perhaps somewhat warmer than the present world, probably even a bit more intense storms at times. So that's the basic setting. Just another one to remind that when I mentioned that the component of the sediment that is clay and silt was coming out of mountains, this is what I'm referring to. They're called the tectonic mountains, and they resulted from the collision of, well, we call it Laurentia, because it's sort of the core of ancestral North America, colliding with a set of volcanic islands that had developed out in the Proto-Atlantic, or Iapetus Seaway. And it was these uplifted terrains that were shedding sediment in various directions from the east, southeast, into the interior, where we're somewhere in about here in what's called the Lexington Platform at the time, a relatively shallow water area with deeper regions to the north that I'll show better in another figure. That's the basic setting. The original layer cake. Now here is another topic I want to discuss a little bit. Perhaps you're aware, or perhaps not, that one of the controversial ideologies that came out of the so-called Cincinnati School, and you've heard Richard Davis and others talk eloquently about the Cincinnati School with people like E.O. Ulrich and others, was a notion that we sometimes call layer cake stratigraphy. And I want to say tonight that this concept was very maligned during much of the 1900s. It was thought of as a false notion. The idea that there were layers that could be traced great distances, that didn't change much, that one could connect these up over perhaps tens of miles or hundreds of miles, came really from the study of rocks like these that we all know and love in the Cincinnati region. And I will argue tonight that although it was a much maligned concept in the days after Ulrich, so in the 1920s and 30s, and Ulrich himself was much maligned, that there is much to be said for the notion of layer cake stratigraphy after all. Tonight I ate dinner with a fellow, Hans Hoffman, who was a great Canadian geologist. I had hoped he would come, but I was very tired, and he used to be in this department, by the way, in the 1960s. And he gave a very interesting talk in this room just a few hours ago about some of the structures in these rocks. But one of the things he said to me is, well, you know, Carl, it's very difficult to say much about cyclicity because none of the layers in the Cincinnati can be traced anywhere. And I said, hang on, Hans, come to my talk tonight, which he didn't do. Okay, he's tired, understood, but I will say to you something quite different from what you're saying, which is the given knowledge, or it was at least when I came here, it was beginning to change because of people like Pryor, Wayne Pryor, and Dave Jeanette, and others, and Steve Holland, of course, who was also here in this room earlier and also didn't come to talk, although I will talk about his ideas and mine and how they don't quite agree, although we are great friends and have lots to discuss. But he had to go to a Reds game. So, well, you've heard about the Cincinnati School, and Richard could tell you much more about it than I. But here's Uncle Happy, that's one of his nicknames. This is, was Edward Otto? Is that, Richard, correct me if I'm wrong.
Oscar.
Oscar? Okay. E.O., I always know, E.O. Ulrich. And he was one of the great stratigrapher, paleontologists of the local area. Had a great influence on many others, including Schuchert, who was one of the great paleontologists of the early 1900s. And Bassler, and many others that you will hear about, no doubt, in some other talk. In some ways, he was a very key member of the Cincinnati School, and he perhaps more than any other person, is associated with this oft-maligned term, layer cake stratigraphy. Ulrich did get himself into trouble. He got himself into trouble by going to New York, because in New York, in the Devonian, he tried to apply his notions brought about by his study of the Cincinnati area rocks to a different theater where there were large deltas that had built out in the Devonian, and at one point at least he argued that all the black shales were about the same age, all the sandstones about the same age, all the Catskill red beds about the same age. And this was certainly found out to be false, because sediments of a delta build outward through time, and the deeper water facies or rocks or environments give way to shallower water ones in a diachronous wave, that is, different ages in different places. So he had his comeuppance with those rocks. And a lot of people sort of argue that, well, Ulrich had a very strange notion of stratigraphy. I actually gave this talk with this figure at a Geological Society of America meeting. People thought I wouldn't have the gall, but I did. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about this layer cake. Now, it's a silly term. Pepperidge Farms. It's a silly term, but yet I want to be a bit serious about it too. A layer cake, because a layer cake has different layers of cake that are separated by frosting layers or horizons. And to put it in this analogy, Ulrich's original view might have been too extreme in the sense that he viewed a layer cake as being each layer a particular lithology all the way across. If it was chocolate in the west, it was chocolate in the east as well. That it was a more or less consistent blanket of material of the same type, which sort of violates a lot of things that we know about how sediments accumulate in some ways, although it depends on the setting that you're in. I would point out not only the cake layers, which he said to be uniform, and this is where I think he was really mistaken, but I'd also point out what I call the frosting layers, and that's my term, but I mean by that thin, widespread levels that may provide us a boundary between cake layers. Now, we no longer think, if people think of layer cake at all, and believe me, I'm perhaps one of the stronger advocates of a neo-Ulrichian view. You'll notice that I call this one an Eo-Ulrichian view. Okay, well that's a double entendre, of course, because his initials were Eo, and we use the Latin word root Eo to mean the dawning, or like the Eocene, a dawn of Ulrichian layer cake. But I would say today we have a new and formulating view, still in progress, that I would call neo-Ulrichian, or neo-layer cake, meaning new. And the idea of that is that there are indeed through-going layers, in a way, that we can correlate. Part of the reason that we can do that is because of the frosting layers, and I'll talk a little bit about those. They're thin, they're widespread, and often they have peculiar characteristics to them. But we would no longer think of the cake layers as being uniform. Oh yes, in my original talk I tried in a very botched way to show a gradation between chocolate and vanilla. I literally took a piece of cake and squished them together to try to make a slide, but that slide is not one I'm terribly proud of. So it doesn't appear here. But let me say that in a neo-layer cake view, perhaps we have layers, but they may change from chocolate to vanilla as we trace them laterally. The important thing is, however, that we have bounded layers that can be traced, and I think this is where those who, like my dear friend Hans Hoffman, who said, oh, well, nothing can be traced, look again, I would say. So just very briefly, what are some of the notions of Ulrich that sort of were pervasive around the turn of the last century? Widespread, uniform